In today's episode, I'm joined by Oliver Mudge, a recruitment expert with over 25 years of experience. We talked about how to stand out in oversubscribed roles, how to overcome imposter syndrome, and how to leverage tools like AI without losing your authentic voice. Oliver's been in the game for years, and we get into some of the insider tips he uses to find and support candidates looking to get into the ESG and sustainability space. So without further ado, please enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with Oliver Mudge from Start Talent Solutions. Welcome to the Positive Career Coach podcast or videocast. We've just had a bit of an intro and heard about some of your experience, but I'd be delighted to hear that in your own words and lead us into what motivated you to become a recruiter in this space in the first place.
Thank you, Andy. Well, yeah, as I've spent 25 years in the recruitment and executive search space, worked with some incredible companies, had 3 businesses. And I think really when the children came along 12 years ago, like most, had a pretty profound effect on me. I was spending a lot of time in London. I wasn't seeing the children kind of most of the week. And as a father, that just didn't sit well with me. So on the work front, I wanted a more sustainable lifestyle, pardon the pun. But actually having children really made me reflect on their future, our future, and the impact I wanted to have on them, not only as a father, but the world in which they grow up in. And I think, when you evaluate all of that, your mission, if you like, your purpose as an individual changes. As a young recruiter, having set up multiple businesses, it was probably about profit. When children come along, it's more about having a more wholesome life and creating a space for them to grow in a safe environment. So I think that was possibly the biggest impact. But in reflecting on that, obviously as a child myself, I love being outside, the great outdoors. I was at my happiest when I was outside, nature, you name it, I was at my happiest. So I was really looking at areas in recruitment where I could look and develop and really hang my hat on for the next kind of 10, 15 years until I get out of the industry. And I think sustainability and climate are both, on a personal level, very, very interesting to me, but also crucial from a planetary perspective, a human race perspective, and ultimately wanted to focus on areas in which I could have a positive impact on the businesses I'm working with, but ultimately those businesses are having a positive impact on the world in which we live. So I think those are probably the kind of headline reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to say the majority of people that I speak to and work with, it's when kids come along. And there's a bit of a profound shift in perspective, isn't there? I know that's true for me, and I know that's true for a lot of people. But you focus specifically on early stage markets, and I wonder, what is it about that has piqued your interest, or piqued your interest, I should say?
Well, I think, yes, the early stage and the growth stage are the 2 key areas of my focus. But throughout my career, I've worked in corporate recruitment, and if you look at the corporate side of sustainability, for example, which I still work in, sustainability as a profession has developed quite significantly over the years. And when you actually break that down and look at what the sustainability function does, it's incredibly interesting. It crosses all aspects of the business. Clearly, you've got your governance side of it, ESG, which is the kind of ticking the box side of things. But actually, sustainability implemented correctly covers so many other interesting areas of the business: supply chain, upstream, downstream. You've got product development, you've got community impact, you've got all sorts of incredible things in there. And then on the softer side of it, the skills that one might need to get into sustainability is so diverse as well: communications, marketing, product management, project management. So I think the sustainability role and function actually as a recruiter is a really interesting role to work in, or to recruit in, because you're talking to such a diverse cross-section of people. So I think I'd add that because that's really important as a concept overall. But in terms of the early stage market, the startup market, I think I worked with my first startup back in about 2000, whatever. 2, 3 zeros, I don't even know how you say it. But the 2 founders, I met them. They were a tech startup, and they were really grappling with recruitment problems. They couldn't build their team. They didn't have social media then, didn't really have an awful lot of access to advertising, and they were really stuck. So we sat down and we really worked out how we were going to build their first team. And long story short, within 3 months, I'd found them their first 5 people, and the team was starting to grow. And, the process we went through, we can talk about later, I'm sure, but, it's still consistent today. But the fundamentals of that, 20 years later, one of those guys is still there. 5 of the founding team, the average tenure is around 10 years. So as a recruiter working with 2 individuals, I saw a huge amount of impact in terms of what I did. I saw the success of that, and more importantly, saw those people thrive. And the business is now 200 people, still going strong, still in touch with the CEO 25 years later. So I think from an early stage in my recruitment career, working with smaller businesses has always derived a lot of satisfaction for me, because of that close interaction, not just with the founders, but with the business as a whole.
Yeah. And I think that's why I'm really looking forward to this conversation, because having this point of view at the intersection of the challenges that small organizations face in the recruitment space and the challenges that the people that I work with more generally around the candidate space, this intersection is really important, because a lot of the recruitment process feels quite broken in that early stage, particularly in climate tech, etc. And people I'm trying to help are suffering because of that. So you've just mentioned that you had this 20-year experience, that first early startup, taking those 2 founders and finding them their first 5 employees. A lot has changed in those 2 decades. And I'd be curious about your thoughts on the problems which you're seeing in the recruitment process at the moment, from a company perspective and also from a candidate perspective, because I think the full picture gives both sides a bit of an understanding of, I guess, what the other side is dealing with, struggling with, and wants.
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. That 25 years I've been in the industry, a huge amount has changed. And, I hate to say it, but we were selling CVs by fax when I first entered the industry. So, you think it's about how technology has evolved alone. And in that period, it's quite unbelievable. But I think if you go back to basic principles here, any business, your people are probably your single biggest critical asset. And I think, it's in essence, all businesses should view themselves as recruitment businesses, because, hiring the right people can be fundamental to your success. Hiring the wrong people can be equally detrimental. And I think with failure rates in early stage businesses so high, up to 80%, that makes your kind of people aspect, your talent strategy, your recruitment approach even more critical. So I think, when you look at that, that should really shape how you think as an organization, as your baseline principle. This is a critical asset. We've got to invest in this. We've got to invest in it correctly. So in terms of the challenges and best practice and bad practice I see, I think, it's worth framing it as well from the point of view that the maturity of the organization obviously has an impact on where somebody is at in their journey from a talent and recruitment perspective. Use an example of 2 early stage founders, fresh out of university, brilliant academic background. They've got a really good product. They've tested market product fit, and they're going for investment. They're looking for seed investment. They just have not had prior experience of recruitment. So you've got that cohort. You've then got the growth businesses that are at that intersection of how the hell do we grow? How the hell do we bring the people in at the pace we need to? And then you've got the more established hyper growth businesses, which of course have had the benefit of time to develop that strategy. So I think if we just focus on the kind of super early stage and the kind of growth phase from the context of this conversation, I think that might be quite helpful. So just some headlines. What do I see? Well, I think the headline thing is that a lot of companies I talk to haven't defined what I would call a talent strategy. And in that for me is not just about the recruitment process itself. It's far more reaching than that. It's going right back to what are our values as a business, what's our strategic objective, and then right through the process. You're talking about pre-hiring, defining roles correctly. You're then talking about the recruitment process itself, is designing that correctly. It's then about onboarding. It's then about training development. It's about succession. It's about future planning. It's about resource planning. So, as an early stage business, you might question if that's really necessary. There's two of you, you need bums on seats. We've got to go to market, but actually I'd argue, no, it's absolutely essential. That doesn't need to be the finished product. It can be work in progress, but you've got to have that mindset from an early stage, I think, to create a framework on which you can base all your recruitment activities and all your onboarding activities, for example. Taking that further, we see lots of examples in the industry, not just early stage, but across all companies of poorly crafted job descriptions. That's a big one. I'm sure we'll talk about that a bit in a minute. I see a lot of homogenized recruitment, people recruiting the same way, the same kind of people, not, the same templates, and not necessarily learning from prior recruitment. Inconsistent go-to-market strategies around, how they approach the recruitment itself, and then the associated recruitment processes thereafter are inconsistent. And again, we can talk about that. I think poor candidate experience is also a huge element here, and something that people don't factor into their thinking.
Just because a lot of the people who will be listening to this are on that other side, and I hear all of the frustrations, the points around poor job descriptions, inconsistent approach with the go-to-market and so on. How does that translate into poor candidate experience?
Well, I think that the nicest way of reframing that is to say, what does a brilliant candidate experience look like? If you were applying for a job, what would you want the process to look like, in terms of the human touch, the process itself, how many stages, feedback, is it a bloated process? Is it a streamlined process? Are you meeting the right kind of stakeholders? Are you incrementally getting more and more engaged with that company as you go through the process? From the minute you first discovered them, i.e. the job description, right through to your final interview and offer and beyond. So it doesn't stop at the offer, it still continues, as I said, with regards to the talent strategy. But that whole candidate journey from the minute they've seen your business to the minute they join that business, that's what I would call the candidate experience. So,
and for the small organizations who are listening to this, how can we incentivize them to improve that candidate experience? What is in it for them?
Better results, ultimately. Reverse engineer it. What does outstanding look like? If you were applying for your own job, how would you want to be treated? How would you want to be valued? Take it back to your own principles, if you like, or as a cohort of founders, or match it to your culture. But reverse engineer it, and then what looks amazing, and what journey would I want to go on? Because I think if you're recruiting in that model or in that mindset, then you're going to attract the right kind of people. Yeah. I think the incentive's quite obvious. At the end of it, you're more likely to get engagement at offer stage, because that journey is growing all the time.
Yeah, and it's first impressions, right? Absolutely. Looking back over my own career of 20 years, I can remember those early experiences with organizations that just in that first outreach and the first engagement, you come away from thinking, this is going to be awesome. And on the other side, I'm not even sure I want to work here because these people are a bunch of idiots. So it's a huge first impression play for having this done correctly. And hopefully, if everybody on both sides of this equation is listening to this and can improve just a little bit, then the world will be a happier place.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the big kind of buzzwords out there at the moment is kind of hire for cultural fit. And again, you can create a journey that really mirrors that. And I think that's important. But, I guess, again, it depends on the maturity of the organization. If there's two of you, then what culture can you really talk about? You can't talk about the culture you've created, but you can talk about the culture you aspire to be. And all these kind of subtleties that go into your kind of pre-hire thinking around vision and values and culture and where you're aiming for really should shape that and be reflected in that candidate journey.
Yeah. So we mentioned reverse engineering. Is there any specific other points that you want to pull out for tips or advice for organizations who are looking to improve their candidate experience?
I think ultimately it goes back to, good practice, full stop. define that talent strategy. There's lots of literature out there about the different pillars of that. That some will be obvious, some less so. Really spend some time about thinking about that. When you're developing your actual role profiles, spend some time on that. Don't rely on generic job descriptions that you've seen elsewhere. Just copy paste, top and tail. Really invest some time in that. Get all the stakeholders involved. If you're a bigger business, if you're a smaller business, really think about the wording, the tone. Is it reflective of who you are as an organization? Does it set out realistic expectations? Is it clear, etc.? And then, when you then develop your recruitment process itself, think about all of that, the whole journey. I should add before that, think about the approach that you take in terms of how you attract those candidates. Consider a multi-channel approach. I think a lot of people rely just on advertising still, which, I've got to question that. There's so many avenues and channels that one can employ now. Utilize all of them and really think about the benefits of which are going to work best for you and come up with that strategy before you go to market with this well-crafted job description. I think that is absolutely, without doubt, an essential component of all of this. And I think then once the candidates are in that journey, you've really got to think about the process itself. What I do see a lot of organizations failing to do is apply a consistent approach. I'll often talk to a scoring framework for each candidate that's consistent across all candidates. So you're measuring against the same things. All stakeholders are clear on what that process looks like. Score each candidate, reflect on that, write your interview notes independently before you come back together and review that. So it's objective. You're trying to remove that bias situation, which creeps in a lot in recruitment. And you're trying to come up with a balanced set of kind of results. And if you like, it's quite basic, but it's starting to encourage a kind of data-driven approach to recruitment.
So, Oliver, 20 plus years in this, hundreds, if not thousands of candidates, you must have seen it all. So, bearing in mind our audience are listening to this, thinking about best practice and things that they should be doing as candidates, as well as the companies, what have you seen in terms of bad practice, the things to avoid? What makes a bad candidate?
Great question. And I suppose I don't necessarily like the concept of a bad candidate. I think, some candidates are simply not aligned to a role and not right for a role, and that's fine. And others are just simply not positioning themselves well for the roles in which they are a good fit. So I think clearly, that's one way of considering what bad candidate might or might not look like. But I think more importantly,
I think that's brilliant. I think that's a great start. There is no bad
everyone deserves a chance, but let's be realistic here. Organizations need to recruit the right kind of people, and they've defined that. So let's talk about that. And I think one approach I like to think about. Before I say that, you've probably got three cohorts of people out there. You've got very active candidates. Let's say you've been made redundant. It's urgent. You find a new role. Your approach to the job market is going to be very different to somebody who's, say, a passive candidate and not looking. So the behaviours of somebody that's perhaps becoming a bit desperate, they've interviewed for lots of roles, they've applied for hundreds of roles, and they're perhaps not making any progress with that, then that's going to drive certain behaviours, which we won't necessarily talk about in length, but that will have an impact on the outcome, right? You've got the passive candidate market, which I would consider to be not looking, i.e. they're very happy or outwardly very happy in their role. And then you've got the active candidate that's probably somewhere in the middle. If the right opportunity comes along, they will certainly consider it. So I think depending on where you sit will probably determine how you approach the job market. But let's just say focus on the active candidate market, or if in your world, the transition candidates as well, because I think this advice is equally applicable. Some common things we see, spray and pray. People make that decision that it's time to make a move. And they hit the apply button. I was talking to a guy last week, really senior CTO. He's working 3 time zones at the moment, 4 years in the startup. Role's been going fantastically well, and had a brilliant conversation about what they'd achieved. So why looking to leave it? It'd be quite quite simple. Working 3 time zones, 14-hour days, young family, it had become unsustainable. So he just literally sat there one Saturday and just started hitting easy apply. And by Monday morning, so what have I done? I'm an experienced guy. Why am I doing this? There's no structure to this. So I think that's, before you start your job search at whatever stage you're at, I think it's really valuable to just sit there and really think about what you want to achieve in this, and then take that back to basic principles. Why are you looking? What's the reason behind that? Is it well-being? Is it mental health issues based on where you're at? Is it you want a career change? You want to move into a new industry? I think you need to be really clear on what your purpose is and define your mission around that. And I think that's particularly applicable for those transitioning, say, into sustainability or climate tech, very much in your argument, it's be clear on exactly where you want to go and make sure that you try and consolidate your search around the key principles of that, the key drivers of that, because I think that encourages people to be very focused on what they're looking for and the kind of roles that they're applying for.
Yeah, I think the focus is absolutely essential, because unless you have a personal degree of focus and commitment to one particular sector or field, it's hard to turn up and present yourself as a credible candidate if you're just applying to everything, because you need to have demonstrable interest and, I hate to use this word, but a passion for the problem solution pair. And you can't do all of the problem solutions. So you really need to work on to finding that one in order to bring it home. And so that spray and play, as you say, Oliver, I don't think it's helpful. It's great for a dopamine kick of I've applied for 58 jobs this morning, but it's unlikely you're going to get much from that.
Exactly. And I think that can also have a negative effect. It's not a numbers game, in my humble opinion. The more you apply, the response rates by default going to get lower, which is actually demoralizing. I think I would always encourage people to spend a lot more time on the roles that they're looking at, and there's lots of useful advice around that. And I think the whole easy apply thing on LinkedIn, for example, and other job boards has made people quite lazy in their approach. They'll look at their job title and think, oh, I could do that, and they might read and skim the first parts of the role profile and think, yeah, that ticks the boxes, I'll just apply. And that due diligence isn't there. And I think, going back to my passive candidate comment, you should be asking yourself the so what question. Why me? Convince me this is right. So, in other words, try and convince yourself that this is the right opportunity best you can with the resources you have in front of you. Have a look at the company, make sure that they sit with you, and do a bit of research before you apply. Because I think that check and balance process, even if it's a relatively short period of time, you've stepped away from it, you've thought about it, and therefore you're more likely to craft a response that is really applicable to the role and ultimately help you stand out.
Yeah. Due diligence is essential. And I've been obviously on the hiring side for years, and you can immediately tell when someone turns up and they've got a very broad understanding of what you do versus someone who turns up and said, Andy, I think this is the problem that you're trying to address, and here's what your competitors are doing about that, and here are some suggestions or solutions that I've been really interested in. And it's immediate flag to say, you are the kind of people that I want to come and help me solve this problem. So yeah, great. Due diligence is essential.
You're talking about the interview process there, and I think to get the interview, you've got to do just as much of that hard work.
True.
That's quite key, and we're increasingly seeing AI creep into that, and technology, and people becoming more lazy. I think when I applied for my first job, you had to craft a letter, you neatly folded it in an envelope, and you were worried about how that looked. You had to use your best handwriting, make sure the stamp was stuck on correctly. It was all about first impressions, and that part of it is gone in a way. Some companies just don't even expect covering letters. So if your CV is not well crafted and well tailored for that particular opportunity, what hope have you got? So I would always encourage people to add what they can. Do that covering letter, even if it's not not required as part of the application process, and maybe even go beyond that, embed a video link within that CV or that covering letter to really showcase why you're interested in that opportunity, why you're relevant for that opportunity, and so on. So I think there's a lot people can do. And going back to the kind of advertising space, obviously we're seeing a huge number of applications for roles now. Sometimes in the hundreds, and we can probably talk about that later on. But I would always say you've got to be in it to win it. I know that's a bit of a cliche, but I think that is genuinely putting people off applying for roles. For roles being open for a few days, a matter of days, and it's got 300-400 applications. I think that's deterring people from actually applying for a role that they could be a very good fit for. So I think the mindset needs to be right as well, and say, well, I'm going to ignore the noise. If this opportunity looks great, then I'm really going to focus on that.
And what about the sort of the balance of when we're making these applications, we're thinking about our degree of fit and for a particular role. There's a lot of self-doubt and imposter syndrome that creeps in. So how would you suggest we balance the kind of the achievement side and also recognizing what we might feel to be failures and sort of framing that and bringing the whole story together?
Great question. And I think if you look at that historically, it's always been about achievement. What have I done? And, I think if you certainly look at the startup world, failure is actually not a bad thing. People learn by their failures, then great. How have you learned from that? How have you developed as a person? Is a great thing to be able to recognize. So I'm not saying that should be, a section in its own right. Hey, look, here are my achievements, and then another section of here are all my failures. But I think one should be reflective of that and bring that into the equation where appropriate, because that shows a lot about somebody, that they can admit a failure and they can learn from failure, and actually that can turn into a real positive. In the same way, I like to see people really talk about their strengths. Understand what your strengths are. Do a Gallup's test. Gallup strengths. Go through that process. Understand what your real strengths are and how they map to your key skills and how they map to you as a personality. Because I think strengths is a good one in terms of it covers so many areas. It allows you to talk about cultural fit. It allows you to talk about things that really light you up within your work. Where do you perform best? So I think beyond, just the standard achievement stuff, there's so much more people can bring into their profiles that aren't always there.
Yeah. And I think that's increasingly important in climate and sustainability, where the demand for roles is outstripping supply, particularly in the list of skills. And most of the job descriptions that we see are like a unicorn shopping list. And so not everybody, there's just not enough people with that list of skills. I was reading a great example, looking for candidates to submit that had got more than 5 years experience in a particular sector. But this sector hadn't really even been a thing 3 years ago. So we keep coming up with this kind of disparity between what people are asking for, what is available, and what people can do. So that move to hiring for culture, hiring for fit, hiring for strengths, not necessarily experience, is definitely something that I'm seeing on the rise. And I wonder whether that's something that you see and how you bring that into the equation when you're thinking about candidate and a company match.
Absolutely. And I think, one thing I would say is that that's often very hard to measure without having that kind of personal interaction with someone. You can't put all of that on a CV, and conversely, you can put all of that softer stuff in a job description. It's very hard to articulate that sometimes. And I think that's where, technology, AI could be quite dangerous, because it's missing those subtle nuances in the person or their experience that you just simply can't pick up until you've had that conversation with them. So on the one hand, technology is driving efficiency, but actually potentially losing that insight that you get in having that kind of conversation. So I think in terms of how that translates to recruitment, it's very important that recruiters, be it internal recruiters, external recruiters like myself, hiring managers, are very aware of that, and build that into their thinking, because you're not just assessing skills anymore. There's so many other factors in play.
I'm going to jump back slightly, Oliver, because we mentioned the oversubscribed role and the intimidation that people feel when they see their ideal role and 500 applications that have already gone in on LinkedIn. It can be very off-putting, but at the same time, it's one of the metrics that a lot of these platforms are using. So we're sort of incentivized to encourage these applications. And I wonder what advice that you have, both from the company side and the candidate side, in how to approach what may feel an oversubscribed position. What do you think the problem is? What can be done about it?
I'm glad you hear that, because I hear it a lot as well, on the recruiter side. And there's frustrations all around, from the candidate, start with candidates, like you say, if you see a role, it's been live 2 days on LinkedIn, it's got 200 applications, and you're naturally going to question whether or not you can be bothered. Do you want to be do you want to be the 201st candidate? Will I even be seen? Will my application even rise to the top? So, I question why these sites declare those kind of numbers outwardly to the candidate market, at least, because I don't really know what that's achieving. So yeah, I guess the best advice from a candidate point of view is to probably say, well, ignore that. If the opportunity is right, then you're probably going to have to work a bit harder to make sure you stand out in that 201, 300, 400 candidate pile. And there's various ways you can do that. If you use LinkedIn as a good example, you already know who the company is if they're advertising directly. Get on there, go and look at some of the team members, look at their profiles, maybe connect with some of the people within the team you might be joining, or if it's a senior role, maybe connect with a couple of senior peers within that organization. If it's a slightly larger organization. Just get a flavor for what the organization is like. Where have they hired from typically previously? Are they receptive to non-industry people, for example? Build a picture of what their prior hiring looked like, because I think that can really inform you as to how you present yourself. If they're that homogenized recruitment company, for example, or business, as I mentioned earlier, that only recruit from Google and they only recruit from X, and you've got to have a certain academic background. If you don't fit that, then you probably say to yourself, I might not get past first base. However, if they're a bit more creative in their thinking, then you can be equally as creative in your thinking. So I think, if that opportunity really resonates with you, if the company, their purpose and whatever really resonates with you, work a bit harder than everyone else, be creative. If you don't hear back in a couple of days, for someone this might be quite tricky to do, but follow up if you can. If there's a recruiter or a hiring manager on there, drop them an email. If you can get their email, give them a call. If you can give them a call and just say, look, I've made this application. I just want to check it's registered. And, it gives you a 30-second opportunity to really promote yourself again. If that doesn't work, one thing I've recommended a few times to people is put a little video together, send a link to the hiring manager, to the team, network with the team. You can get your name in front of the business a bit more than just relying on the interface of whatever their recruitment interface is, whether it's their website, LinkedIn. And I think you've got to be positive about that and see that as an opportunity to stand out. And I appreciate some people will find that difficult. I work in sales and don't mind promoting myself, but for those that don't like promoting themselves, I can see that as being, a bit more challenging. But I think have faith in yourself and do it. Because if you don't, someone else will.
Yeah. I love that, Oliver. And I think that really talks to the requirement to have a clear focus and a narrow niche, because you need to be investing the time. And so you need to feel committed enough to this particular path, because you can't do this for all the ideas and all the potential opportunities that you see. So it's important to narrow that focus as early as you can. Something that you said there about doing the detective work to figure out what the previous hiring plan looks like. How would you suggest someone goes about doing that? Because that's a really, really good idea.
Obviously, if it's a relatively small company, it can be quite easy. Just flick through either all the people within the kind of team areas that you would be working within potentially, and if they're a really small business, go through the whole company, have a look.
On LinkedIn.
If they're on LinkedIn, or if you're on LinkedIn, definitely, I think that can be really helpful. It can really help you build a picture of kind of organization, or the kind of organizations they hire from, kind of people they hire from. Then that wouldn't work for every company, but in some cases it can. give you quite a big clue. And in the same way as a recruiter, if I'm looking to perhaps engage with a company, I really like their purpose and mission, I would always go and look at that. Where do they hire from? What are their hiring trends? How many have they hired over the last 6, 12 months? What's the dynamic look like? Because
And
I
are there
think it
any
helps
tools that
shape
you
that
would
picture.
any tools that you would suggest that people use? So LinkedIn, go find the people who work at the company, see what their past roles were like, and see if you can build that picture. Is this something like Glassdoor can give you an insight to? We're looking at retention and turnover and that kind of approach. Where else could we get some of this information from?
Yeah, I think the detective work is two parts really. It's just to get a general sense of the organisation, and you can do that through their website, career pages, LinkedIn, and any other kind of public sites that they showcase that on. And I think, as you say, Glassdoor's a pretty good tool to get a bit more insight into what prior employees and current employees think of the organisation. Again, I would always view that with a bit of caution because it's very rare you jump on a website to give a positive review. The bias tends to be towards the negative experiences.
Yeah.
With most of these type of review sites, not always, but sometimes. And again, I wouldn't necessarily let the thoughts of one or a few individuals put you off. If for example, that can be quite damaging as well.
Yeah, you only need one disgruntled employee, I should say, and take it all with a pinch of salt, but it is a data point, but it is only one data point. So have a broad sample.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Oliver, are you ready to talk about everybody's favorite topic, artificial intelligence and the impact on, well, not just life, the universe and everything, but specifically in recruiting? Now, this is a hot topic, and it's often been likened to a bit of an arms race. On the one side, we've got the corporates and the small companies and the hiring platforms increasing the use of AI for screening and ranking and rating. And on the other side, we've got candidates using ChatGPT to figure out what is being requested and then keyword stuff their applications and so on, and then have them write their own CVs, etc. And it's doing this all the time. So very open question, to take this where you will, because it is a hot topic. But I guess pros, cons, for it, against it, how would you suggest people approach this whole topic? And again, given your unique position of working both sides of the fence, I guess I was going to ask you who's winning, but I don't think it's a fair question. I guess a better question would be to see what are some of the common downfalls of over-reliance on both sides.
Wow, that's a big topic, and there's a huge amount, as you say, that's been made of it in recent times. And if I was to believe any of it, 2 years ago, a year ago, last week, then I wouldn't be in recruitment anymore, because apparently AI was going to replace everyone and everything. And there was a real fear around that. But let's not forget that recruitment is about people. And for me, the human interface between person, whether you're a recruiter with a candidate with a potential employer, the human interface is never going to be replaced. So I think that would be my first comment, first and foremost. Let's not forget the importance of that person-to-person interaction. Let's accept and acknowledge that AI, and not just AI, but technology, has a massive part to play in improving efficiencies in certain areas, time saving, and of course can handle repetitive tasks at ease. So there are elements of recruitment that I think technology and AI, at the end of the day, if you look at the metrics on which most people consider hiring success, it's time to hire, it's retention, it's cost of recruitment. So in many respects, technology and AI can drive all of those down and improve all of them. But I think from a candidate perspective, I think it's really important to be aware of how technology is being used now, and it's being used right across from the minute you see the organization to the minute you leave. AI technology is there, and it's assessing everything. So I think as a candidate in the candidate market, it's good to be aware of that, because if you just think about writing a CV, for example, companies and probably smaller stage businesses are utilizing these technologies less because of the costs, and also they just don't have the volume that they're processing. But even still, if a company is using AI to rank candidates, for example, then all they've got is the CV and the context within that CV. I haven't seen anything yet that's clever enough to really go away and then say, right, who's it working for? What's that organizational profile like compared to us? And then base that on that whole CV. That will be coming without doubt, where they look at that whole employment background, they go and look at the organizations, and they really build up a really true picture. It's coming quickly, and there are elements of it out there. And I think when they get to that, then you might be able to take it quite seriously and to an extent. And we'll talk about the cautions in a minute. But I think candidates just need to be mindful of that when they're writing their CVs. And if technology is being used to evaluate skills, for example, make sure the relevant skills are on your CV. Make sure it's within your cover letter, and it's basic stuff, but it's important stuff. So I think that's quite a key thing to think about. And I think obviously on the client side, the same applies. People fall through the gaps because the CV might not be constructed in the right way. The right words might not be on there. So, you might be overlooking the best candidate just because you're relying on technology to evaluate your talent pool. So my first principle is always you've got to still include that human element to make the more critical decisions, apply the critical thinking, if you like. Otherwise, you do run the risk of walking away from a situation and or a job because technology says no. And I think that I wouldn't yet feel confident in putting my faith in that. I use AI not that regularly, mainly for task automation. Taking interview notes, for example, stuff like that. It can be incredibly useful. But I certainly wouldn't let technology say yes or no to a hire. I think that the human has to have the final decision.
Yeah.
Without
So you've touched on a couple of points there. That it brings its own concept of bias into the hiring process. And
we're trying to avoid bias in recruitment, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
So,
yeah.
You've got to look at AI and how these algorithms are built. If they're built in a certain way, that's going to be reflected in a certain way. And one common thing is, from the candidate side, if you're relying on ChatGPT, for example, if you're relying on an older model, it's going to be referencing older data, and it might be referencing out of date data and links. So you've got to be really careful about how you use it, and you've got to validate everything that you do. Ultimately, I think still.
Yeah. So for a candidate, where is the sweet spot of making use of these AI tools? Like, what is the advantage, I guess? Because we just talked about, there's this risk of using outdated models and so on. One of the other risks is obviously sounding like you're just a ChatGPT. The ubiquity of they all sound the same, etc. So what tips or advice would you give to candidates who are looking to use AI in their job search?
Well, I think it's really useful for the transitions, right? Because if you're looking to, you've identified some markets that you really resonate with you. You might want to go and work in agri-tech, or you might want to work in the circular economy in a particular space. There's so many organizations out there all the time growing. So AI can be really useful from a market research perspective, market analysis perspective, competitor analysis perspective. You can quite quickly build target lists of organizations that you might want to work for. Also, you've got other tools, LinkedIn and other business networks and directories within this space that you can refer to as well. But AI can quite quickly bring all that together in one place for you. It can tabulate it. It can put it in a spreadsheet. It can really save you an awful lot of time. So I'd say from a market research perspective, it can be very powerful. I think without doubt, it can be useful as well from a first draft perspective. If you want to look at CVs, you want to look at covering letters. But again, as I said earlier, always put some context into that. Is it written in your own language? Have you asked GPT to read stuff you've written before to write in the same language? You can train it to do that. But again, I go back to my earlier point about due diligence. if you could knock out a cover letter and a CV in 5 minutes based on the job spec and get GPT to do it for you, is that what I would call due diligence? Probably not. So you've still got to put that human layer into that, and you've still got to contextualize it, make sure you're happy with it. That would, be my big caution on that. But without doubt, I think there are elements of it that are very, very useful.
I was thinking about, and we were talking about this before we hit record on this conversation, about where the market is heading. So what have you seen recently, and where do you think the trends are heading in terms of the recruitment process in general? I think specifically quite interested in the methods that companies are using to fill that sort of mid-management to senior level roles, which is a lot of the clients that I work with. They're in that position, but it's often been quite a long time since they've actually had to do the whole job application process. And so it's, being good at a job and being a job applications are two very different things. So what's new and what's coming in terms of this whole process? If you're speaking to someone mid-senior level, hasn't done this for a while, what do they need to know?
That's a really good question, and I think probably answered in two or three ways. I think you talk about process there, and let's start there, because I think that is very important. And I think fundamentally, if you're looking at the recruitment process bit rather than the talent strategy bit for a senior hire, I wouldn't say that has evolved significantly in my time in recruitment. The tools for assessment have, but the due diligence that goes into a senior hire is always pretty complex and detailed, and has been for a considerable amount of time. How that's changed subtly over time, and obviously online assessments, psychometric assessment, disc profiling, case studies, the things that people bring into the process are really quite organizational specific, but the fundamentals of those processes I don't think have significantly changed. The tools and the techniques might have done a little bit, and depending on the sector you're in, is it a heavy tech role? Is it a non-tech role? There will be subtle nuances in that, but if you look at most organizations, say Series A, B, C and above, they will go and do a full industry search. It's very rare that they would just hire someone because their network knows someone. It happens, of course it does. But even if they want to hire that person, they will still go through a fairly comprehensive due diligence process. They'll want to know who's out there in the market. They'll want to talk to the best people in the market. So I think in a sense that hasn't fundamentally shifted. I think what has fundamentally shifted is the market dynamics that we've seen. So if you kind of look back over the last 10 years and the most recent Gallup State of the Global Workplace Force report, for example, paints a pretty grim picture. Well-being in work has declined and is declining. Engagement levels are declining. We have a real issue there, and I think actually these things are the things that are going to be driving how people recruit differently. And the process itself might not change that much, but the things they're looking to address within that process are changing. So in terms of how they outwardly present themselves around things like well-being, mental health, how do they look after their leaders? I think this is going to be crucial. We're at a big tipping point there. How are they going to manage the hybrid world? We're moving towards that, and certainly in the early stage, the growth business stage, people are looking at the global talent market now rather than just, this individual must come from London. If the best person's sitting in Hong Kong or New York or somewhere really remote, that doesn't necessarily mean they won't hire them. So you've got the kind of globalization of the workforce, and it's much easier to hire globally. So I think that also feeds into the process itself. I did a search a couple of years ago for a business in Europe. They wanted a CTO. That CTO had to come from Europe. So that was quite easy. You mapped the market. There was probably 200 to 300 candidates on the long list. We whittled that down. But there were some parameters there that were easy to work with. Those parameters are blurred now. They're much bigger. And actually, from a client side, a recruiter side, and even the candidate side, that makes the market so much bigger and actually harder to navigate. So I think that's going to be quite a key thing.
I think there's two
And
things I'm just going to just bring back a little bit there, because first of all, I think there's a great amount of reassurance that the fundamentals haven't changed, but the way in which it works, or the fundamentals haven't changed, but perhaps some of the parameters and the tools used have done. And I think that's very reassuring for a lot of people. Secondly, I'm just going to we talked about that even fairly early stage organizations are going to want to do a full view of the market. And I think that puts tension on the idea that your network will find you the job, because the network will find you a job means that you network your way into being top of the list when it comes to a role coming up. But the due diligence of going out to the full market to get a full picture suggests that this is less value. So there's a tension between those 2 points of view. How would you sort of balance those two concepts?
that's a good point. And I think, you got to look at the drivers behind that for a start. I think maybe the very, very early stage is slightly inconsistent with what I've meant there. I think you've got to look at the dynamics of the board. What do the board want? There are a lot of external factors that are driving what that search might look like. So on the one hand, organizations might need to and want to go and do that full market map. And conversely, there are many organizations that don't. There's a brilliant guy I spoke to last week that's very successfully transitioned into climate. We can talk about that a bit more in a minute in terms of how that's been done. But that was very much a network thing. And on the face of it, it's like, how did you get that job? It sounds amazing. But so both cases do, without doubt, still coexist. But I guess what I was trying to say is that the process itself, I think, is largely unchanged. It's the dynamics around that that's definitely driving different behaviors.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I take from that point, that this full market search and this network your way through, is full market search suggests to me that you need to be visible in order to be found. So that kind of broadcasting of your position and your presence, and normally digital in this day and age, your digital presence and degree of fit for your future role is as important as your who do you know and how do you know them. So I guess it's a bit of a pincer action. And I think often there is a network, but also the how you present to the world is quite important here as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think everyone talks about profiles and CVs, but actually that's just a very small part of your profile. LinkedIn is obviously very commonly used now. And, I think you really got to think about how you're identified on there, how you identify yourself on there. Are you doing that in a way that's likely to elevate you on those target lists if an organization is going out to search? So I think the two need to match up. I think LinkedIn can be a little bit more generic in a way, because your profile and your covering letter would elevate your skills and experience for that particular role. But your LinkedIn profile just does still need to say what you do, so people can find that. People use varying degrees of kind of ability and technology to identify you. I've been doing it a long time. There's so many different tools and techniques I would use to uncover the whole market, whether I'm doing search or not, versus someone that's not done it before. They might just rely on basic keyword parameters. For example, if you don't fit that keyword parameter, you're not going to show up. So, it's a challenge, and it doesn't mean you want to see 15 pages of keywords on your profile, but it is a challenge. It is a challenge. And I think as an active job seeker, actually, you're looking for the jobs that fit you rather than necessarily people coming to you. You probably want a nice balance of both, if I'm honest.
Yeah. I'm not going to ask you to give away your special sauce and industry secrets, but what one thing would you suggest to candidates that is the step beyond keyword stuffing their LinkedIn profile?
It's being visible. I think the keywords are an element of that, but some people don't put anything on their profile. They'll just put CTO and the company name and one line, and that's fine. And they don't really have anything in their profile section about them. That's just very vanilla, very boring, if you like, doesn't say anything about them. I think that's where, if you look at where somebody sees your profile, the first thing they see is your opening profile statement. That needs to be engaging. That's your opportunity. If I like the look of that, then I'll go and maybe look at where they've worked, who they've worked for, who they're connected to. That's the bit that needs to jump out, I think, if I'm honest. The rest of it, if you know what you're doing, you look beyond all of that anyway. You know what you're looking for. But I think get that profile statement absolutely on point.
Yeah. So once you've got the basics of making sure that you're going to be found by whatever scraping algorithm that we have to address, the next bit is to have a sufficiently engaging intro to your profile to capture the eye of the human, the next level.
And also capture the eye of, as you say, the scrapers out there that people are unfortunately using, just to give yourself the best possible opportunity, really.
Oliver, tell me, if you had one closing piece of positive encouragement given your position between candidate and corporate or early stage startup, for those mid to senior career talent that are trying to put their effort towards making a planet positive change in the climate space, what would it be? What would you want to leave our audience with?
Well, I'm going to say it's going to be more than one bit of advice, I think. But
Brilliant.
I think ultimately start by defining exactly what your purpose and mission is, and what impact you want to have. I know that sounds really simple, but I spoke to a guy last week that has really successfully transitioned from a very senior role in a massive FMCG to the startup world. He's had a brilliant journey over the last 2 to 3 years, and we really dug deep into why. And the motivations to move were personal. 25 years in a business, but he was really clear on what that purpose and that mission was. What did he want to do next? What's really going to excite him for the next few years? So that was his starting point, and I really like that. I think the drivers behind that are kind of irrelevant. And what do you do from there? You develop your market ideas. Where do you want to go? Where do you want to take this? And build on them. Do some market research. Develop your knowledge. Really get the high level concepts of what's important in that industry, within that sector. Really learn it. Invest some time in that. If needs be, go and do some professional qualifications. Meet someone like yourself. Speak to a career coach. Build the narrative around that, because I think that's really important. If you're going into an interview situation against competition that's perhaps been in 1 or 2 organizations that closely aligned to that versus yourself that hasn't, you need those tools to be able to talk about the industry credibly, at least. Be really clear on where your transferable skills are. Be clear on any knowledge gap. Just so you're really comfortable with that, because I think you don't want any surprises in those situations. And I think beyond that, get out there, network, follow some industry thought leaders in that space, ask questions, read articles, get involved, go to some local events, go to some national events, go to some international events, whatever it might be, where you can network with like-minded individuals. Because I think one thing I've found, particularly at the mid-senior level over the last few years, most people within sustainability, climate, there's a very collegiate approach. People like sharing information. They like helping people out. In the same way I do as a recruiter. It's not just about finding people. It's about building networks. It's about collaboration. It's about joining the dots. It's about bringing organizations together in for the greater good. So I think my best bit of advice would be just throw yourself into it and immerse yourself. Speak to your network. Do some free consultancy work. Do some pro bono work. Get out there. Because I think those that have done that seem to have really accelerated their transition. They've immersed themselves in it. And I go back to an earlier point, it depends on your situation as well. If you're jobless and desperately need to pay the mortgage at the end of the month, then you probably haven't time to do all of that. So that transition process might need to be consolidated a little bit, but I would still start with that purpose and mission there and really what you want to do.
Yeah. Could not agree more. The past 20 years in cutthroat corporate to come over to the climate space, where people like recognize that we only win when we all win, when we all come through this together. And it's just open arms, open doors. Everyone who's getting somewhere, they've got one hand reaching forward, one hand pulling someone up with them. And it's awesome. It's a great space to be working. So, Oliver, for people who want to get in touch with you and potentially engage you for your services, what does your ideal client look like? How do you help bring these two sides together? And what is the best way for people finding you to get in touch?
Thank you. Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I love working with purpose-led, impact-led organizations where I can really go beyond the kind of typical role of a recruiter, if you like. I think the 25 years I've spent in the industry really transcends that of a recruiter. It's about, like I say, joining the dots, really helping organizations on that growth journey, not just from a talent perspective, but, networks that are well developed and huge amount of investors out there. Just to give you an example, that's one area where I've connected a lot of organizations with, future investors. But for me, it's about bringing those organizations together, commercial opportunities, marketing opportunities, joint ventures, partnerships, so it's just not about just recruitment, but clearly that's what I get paid to do. So I think, going back to, again, my earlier point, it's whatever journey organizations are at in terms of their talent strategy. They might be at the very beginning. It might be quite developed. So if it's about building that, or it's about bringing in a senior exec, C-level from a more mature organization, been there many times.
Right. Okay.
In terms of contacting me, LinkedIn, email, mobile, I'm sure you'll pop them in the details somewhere, but yeah.
Fantastic. Well, that has been wide-ranging and incredibly informative. So thank you for your time today, Oliver. We'll include details of how people can get in touch with you in the show notes or emails that this goes out with.
Brilliant. And likewise, I hope yours will be in there as well, because the amount of people, certainly, I'd say in the last 12 months, more so than ever, I'm getting more and more people reaching out to me saying, I want to make this transition. And, I think kind of role you can play in that is significant, because, I'd love to be able to help people do that on a daily basis. But ultimately, it's not my day-to-day job. And I can certainly and will always happily provide some advice around that. But I think it's great that you're helping people make that transition, because the opportunities out there are only growing all the time. The leadership pipeline shrinking. We need more leaders in this space. So I think collectively, hopefully, we can help both sides achieve that.
Brilliant. Well, that is what we are both here for. Awesome. Oliver, thank you very much.
Andy, likewise. Thank you.